Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. And the chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. The subcommittee will come to order. Again, good morning. Welcome to today's legislative hearing on preserving Americans' access to AM radio, where we will be examining discussion draft legislation titled the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses, who each have a unique perspective on this debate. Every one of us here, both the witnesses and the members on this dais, should agree that there is a distinct importance of having a robust and widely accessible communications infrastructure to alert Americans and ensure public safety in the event of emergencies and natural disasters. And I will tell you this, I know everyone cares about this particular issue. It's very vital to our districts. Our citizens should have quick access to critical information, which helps them make timely and potentially life-saving decisions to evacuate, stay in place, seek shelter, or contact first responders. The emergency alert system plays a crucial role in this infrastructure, as it can be used across our nation to disseminate this important emergency information. I've long been a champion for improving these public alerts to ensure they reach everyone, as I was the sponsor of the Integrated Public Alert Warning System Modernization Act, which was enacted into law a long time ago, and authorized an update to these systems to incorporate multiple communication technologies, both presently and in the future. The system's requirements also meant alerts needed to go to the largest portion of affected population feasible, including those with access to functional needs, individuals with disabilities, and those in rural and remote areas. States like Florida rely on this system during hurricanes to alert people to dangers related to such powerful storms. I believe this is where AM radio can become so important and will continue to be in the future. According to the Nielsen Media Research, radio broadcasting still has the highest reach of any medium, capable of reaching 91% of American adults, with a majority listening to take place outside of the home, as you know. We know that AM radio signals in particular can cover a large geographic area, especially when other networks fail. Furthermore, people in my district and elsewhere in the most diverse of settings enjoy the differing viewpoints and local perspectives that AM radio offers. I know in my district, in Citrus County, Hernando County, Pasco County as well, I hear from constituents on a regular basis how much they enjoy listening to local news on AM radio, as well as particularly the conservative and Christian radio stations throughout the Tampa Bay area, but also the Nature Coast. So when we heard the reports that certain automobile manufacturers were exploring the idea of getting rid of these options for American consumers, many here in Congress, including myself, expressed concerns, bipartisan concerns. I believe we should maintain as many available options for Americans as possible, and I hope you agree. This is why we are here to discuss the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act. This legislation will require the Department of Transportation to work with the FCC to issue a nationwide standard to ensure that new vehicles have access to AM radio stations. Now, generally speaking, I do have concerns about the broad government mandates, and I hope we can have a robust and constructive discussion from each of our witnesses to ensure that we get this right. We must get it right, and that we are inadvertently hampering, we don't want to inadvertently hamper innovation both now and in the future. That's very important. We also ensure that we don't cause undue cost burdens onto our constituents. That's a great concern. Nevertheless, Americans deserve to have the highest number of options for how they receive information in their homes and in their cars. So I look forward to this hearing. and hearing from all our witnesses. And I really appreciate y'all being here. And you're going to give us some valuable information, I'm sure, and we have some good questions for you. So I'll yield back the remainder of our time, and I'll recognize the gentlelady, the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski, for her 5 minutes so she can give her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I think you and I are very much on the same page, and not to diminish this issue of AM radio that we are going to be talking about today. In some ways, given all the what's going on in the world, in some ways this is kind of a respite to have a typical something from this subcommittee where we deal with everyday issues that affect Americans. AM radio has been delivering for consumers for about 100 years right now. And last year, over 85 million Americans listened to their AM radios. Even more importantly, we know that AM radio has been very important in protecting consumers when all other ways to talk about disasters, dangers, that AM radio is there when other platforms fail. And so it's been very important to have AM radio. For example, Hurricane Ida in 2021 was able 24 hours a day to be able to report what the problems were. And we want to make sure that any kind of disaster is there. But beyond that, we have heard from AARP. Senior citizens are often most vulnerable to issues of safety, but also are among the largest consumers that use AM radio. And we also know that AM radio is important often to Black and Latino communities, and there are over 600 AM stations that broadcast in languages other than that we're used to in the United States, in English. And that is important that we make sure, and we're going to hear more testimony about that from experienced experts here. We also know that AM radio is important often in rural areas and more underserved areas, and where FM may not even be available. So we want to make sure that this is an option that is available. And we know that some automakers have already begun to issue new cars that don't have in their automobiles the option for AM radio. And that leaves a number of people, I think, maybe surprised that they cannot have what they have been using for many years or relying on in the past. So this is an important discussion, and I think that we can work together on a bipartisan basis here. I'm looking forward to hearing from the witnesses on how the loss of AM radio in the car, what it could mean to them. And I look forward to the discussion today, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady yields back. Now I'll recognize the chair of the full committee, Mrs. Rogers, for her 5 minutes opening statement. You're recognized.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses being here to provide their perspectives on the important legislation being discussed to preserve the American people's access to AM radio. This committee is at the forefront of advancing legislation that will strengthen American leadership in cutting-edge technologies. At the same time, as we make the transition to these new technologies, it is vital that we are mindful of unintended consequences and how these kinds of transitions can impact our communities. Communities across the country are now beginning to feel the impact of some automakers deciding to permanently remove AM radio from new vehicle models. At a hearing last year, this committee discussed how important access to AM radio continues to be for many of our constituents. For the people of Eastern Washington, it's how they hear the news in their communities, listen to sports, and receive critical information during emergencies. In some parts of my district, people have limited access to FM radio and broadband, so AM radio is the only source of information. Eastern Washington is far from unique when it comes to our reliance on AM radio. Many members of this committee have constituents who find themselves in similar situations. That's why it's concerning that some auto manufacturers have taken steps to remove AM radios from new vehicle models while disregarding the impact. This decision would affect tens of millions of Americans. Some estimates show that more than 45 million Americans tune in to AM radio each month. AM radio is unique. Not only is it free to consumers, but in comparison to alternatives, it can be transmitted over long distances with relatively low power. It also provides an existence for small broadcasters, especially religious and minority broadcasters, that are highly valued by many Americans, myself included. Removing AM radios from vehicles puts their future at risk. I know some people are quick to dismiss this issue by saying there's plenty of outlets for such content. But while people in some parts of the country have been able to take advantage of alternative options in vehicles for accessing AM radio, like streaming services or satellite radio, these options are still unavailable in many places. We also know from our hearing last year that AM is especially resilient and dependable in emergencies. It is a core piece of our national public warning system, a system used by national, state, and local authorities to communicate life-saving information. Members up and down the dais, across both sides of the aisle, have had firsthand experiences dealing with natural disasters in their states, including wildfires, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, even earthquakes. And while other forms of communication have failed during these incidents, AM radio has often remained resilient, operational, and has been the calming voice in the storm when on the go. Just last week, it was reported that when tornadoes swept across the Midwest, many people were receiving critical emergency updates via AM radio in their cars. We're at a moment where we, as the representatives of the people, are being forced to intervene on behalf of the people because their concerns continue to be ignored by corporations making consumer vehicles. I do not consider a mandate on manufacturers to continue including AM radio in vehicles lightly. But the reality is that automakers have been aware of these bipartisan, bicameral concerns for a long time and have yet to adequately address them with any private sector solutions. It's disappointing, and ultimately it's why we're here today having this discussion. Whether they're tuning in for local news, agricultural and weather reports, information during an emergency, or to listen to their favorite talk show personality, AM radio continues to be a trusted way for Americans to stay connected. AM radio fosters a sense of local identity, connecting people through regional programming that reflects the unique perspectives and traditions of their communities. It's closer to the people, telling the stories and sharing the perspectives that the national news doesn't cover and sometimes ignores. And it plays a crucial role in ensuring local government accountability. I look forward to moving past this issue and getting back to working in a bipartisan manner on other key issues for the future of vehicles in this country, like autonomous vehicle legislation, so that America remains the leader in automotive innovation, not China. I look forward to a productive discussion today as we discuss how to navigate our increasingly digital world. Let us not forget the enduring and necessary role AM radio continues to play for people across the country. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. Very well said. And you know, it's very typical under your leadership, Madam Chair, that we speak on behalf of our constituents, and they truly care about this issue. Now I'll recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bilirakis. AM radio stations are a vital part of our nation's communications system. Tens of millions of Americans listen to AM radio every month, many while driving. And whether it's listening to community news, baseball games, or religious programming, there are many types of diverse programming that can be found across the AM dial. AM radio also provides potentially life-saving information during emergencies, particularly when other communication networks fail in the face of hurricanes, fires, floods, and other emergencies. And AM radio stations are an important distribution of emergency alerts, and there is a network of AM broadcast stations specifically designed to withstand major weather events and other disasters. These stations act as primary entry points for the nation's emergency alert system, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency invests millions of dollars every year to keep these AM radio stations ready to broadcast in emergencies. Now, AM radio played a critical role in my congressional district back in October 2012, when most of coastal New Jersey and New York and many other communities were devastated by Superstorm Sandy. In Monmouth and Middlesex counties, my district, we faced sustained winds up to 80 miles per hour and massive amounts of rain that resulted in major flooding and damage to critical infrastructure. The storm caused the largest power outage in New Jersey's history. Many people lost power for days or even weeks. Cell phone, cable, internet services were disrupted, leaving entire cities and communities disconnected. And many people in my district and elsewhere were left with very few options for receiving life-saving information. They turned to trusted radio stations for critical and time-sensitive alerts. During Superstorm Sandy and the aftermath, radio listenership in my district saw a 247% increase as my constituents turned to AM radio for information. Many stations, even those who don't typically focus on weather, alerts, or news, responded by staying on the air. Throughout the storm and its aftermath, they transmitted up-to-the-minute information on where to find critical supplies like gas and water, as well as weather warnings and messages from government officials. In New Jersey alone, about 880,000 people evacuated due to the hurricane, taking to the roads to keep their families out of harm's way. And for these families, easy and free access to AM radio in their vehicles was critical to their safety and well-being. Other communities have also relied on AM radio during emergencies, including in Louisiana during Hurricane Ida and in California when fires devastated Santa Rosa in 2017. Former FEMA Administrator Peter Gaynor also recently pointed to February's cellular signal blackout that impacted millions of Americans nationwide to underscore the importance that AM radio plays in our nation's emergency infrastructure. Now, in knowing all this, I was deeply concerned last year when some car manufacturers decided to remove AM radio from their new model cars. I'm glad to see that Ford and other manufacturers have reversed course. But as we'll hear today, other companies, especially manufacturers of some electric vehicles, no longer include AM receivers in their vehicles. And as a result, an increasing number of Americans lack access to AM radio. And that's why I'm pleased that we're holding this hearing to discuss draft legislation that would ensure all Americans continue to be able to access AM radio stations from their cars. The discussion draft we're considering today would address this problem by requiring vehicle manufacturers to install equipment to receive AM radio signals in all passenger cars made or sold in the United States at no extra cost to consumers. And I want to thank Chairs Rogers and Bilirakis and Ranking Member Schakowsky for working with me on a bipartisan basis to hold this hearing. I'm encouraged by the discussion draft that we'll consider today, and I look forward to working together to ensure that all Americans have access to AM radio in their vehicles. And with that, Chairman Bilirakis, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you so very much. We have, I believe, Representative Dunn has some stories with regard to Hurricane Michael in the Panhandle and those rural areas. So thank you for bringing that up. So very important. All right, our first witness is Gary Shapiro, CEO of the Consumer Technology Association. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chairs Bilirakis and Rogers and Ranking Members Schakowsky and Pallone and members of the subcommittee. I appear today with one key message. American consumers, not radio broadcasters, should decide what entertainment technologies belong in their cars. We began 100 years ago this month. We were called the Radio Manufacturers Association, and that whole purpose was to foster the growth of AM radio, this new technology. On principle, though, since then, we do not ask government to fund our industry or mandate our products. We believe that the marketplace, not government, should determine what technologies thrive and which technologies grow. That's why we oppose this legislation. We don't believe it's an appropriate role of Congress to mandate the inclusion of a century-old technology in 21st century cars. It's especially inappropriate in the service of an industry that uses public spectrum that it received for free. We have repeatedly urged broadcasters over the last 30 or 40 years to invest in new technology for AM that would improve its sound quality and would have expanded their market share. The response, honestly, has been underwhelming. Of course, we know, and I've just heard, that many Americans do still listen to AM radio for sports, news, talk radio, and cultural and non-English programming. But even without this legislation, most car models, especially those with gas-powered engines and models popular in rural areas, will offer analog AM radio. Where consumers want AM radio, they will get it, and that's the market at work. Given this reality, I'm especially concerned how this mandate would hurt American innovation. The stakes are particularly high for EV makers, an area where Congress has devoted billions of dollars to help out that industry. EV car makers can somewhat reduce the static noise through techniques like shielding and fully redesigning their cars, but these techniques actually add costs and weight and force design trade-offs, limiting consumers, the car makers' ability to innovate in other areas. Now, some EV makers provide access to AM radio using technologies which are newer, and they also support streaming services and satellite radio. They offer access to AM and FM stations free of charge, and they avoid issues with interference. This is a good compromise, and this is digital, although not analog. Congressional action actually does affect our competitive nature and how innovative we are as a country, especially this committee. Our car makers compete for market share globally, and every new mandate adds a burden and puts American businesses at a disadvantage. We don't want to be Europe, where burdensome regulations kneecap the growth of promising technology companies. In fact, we lead with tech companies by far in the world. This committee should also review the actual safety arguments made by the NAB. Today, emergency alerts are shared with the public through many different channels, including digital radio, FM radio, internet-based radio, satellite radio, and cellular networks, as well as internet-based notifications and smartphone alerts. It's no secret that FEMA knows that radio is declining, and the NAB's relentless quest for this unprecedented mandate of mandating an old technology just shows how weak AM radio has become. In fact, we did a study following the October 23 test of the emergency alert system. It found that 95% of American adults received that emergency alert via their phone. Only 1% heard it from AM radio. Effective policymaking does require accurate facts and data. There's no data here. There's no data showing that they will have an impact on FEMA's mission. And since the original version of this bill, FEMA has asked for a government study on how AM radio and multiple other technologies help or hurt emergency alerting. Yet the bill as drafted requires a mandate and then a study. Now, claims that car makers are seeking somehow to stifle religious and talk radio or diversity of thought and multilingual program are simply not true. Car makers have a very specific interest, and that's to give consumers what they want. Automakers are agnostic about whether their customers listen to Sean Hannity or Taylor Swift. They just want to sell innovative and safe vehicles. And speaking of Taylor Swift, AM and FM are the only forms of radio that do not pay performers for their work. Yet digital and streaming platforms pay performance royalties. AM and FM radio use music to build their audience, allowing broadcasters to make billions in revenue from advertising while paying nothing to performers. This is disturbing, given over 240 million songs are played on AM radio every year. And as legislators in Congress have rightly pointed out, the United States is the only democratic nation in the world where artists are not compensated for use of their songs on AM or FM radio. Mandating AM radio would reward this and condone this unfair system, allowing the broadcast industry to reap profits at the expense of artists. Now, broadcasters have repeatedly pushed Congress for laws to preserve their struggling business model. First, it was a rather absurd attempt to mandate FM chips in mobile phones. Now, broadcasters are using the same playbook for AM radio. And actually, under the logic that we hear, there should be a mandate for AM radio in every home, every classroom, every hotel room, and every retail store. That's what a lot of these examples are applied to, and Congress should resist this industry bailout and let consumers make the purchase decisions that align with their preferences. Today, the market is working as intended. Consumers have a choice, and they should have a choice in the future. Thank you very much for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Gentlemen, yield back. Our second witness is Melody Span Cooper, our Chair and CEO of the Midway Broadcasting Corporation. You're recognized.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairs Rogers and
morning.
Bilirakis, Ranking Members Pallone and Schakowsky from the great state of Illinois, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Melody Span Cooper. I have the honor of serving as the chairwoman and CEO of Midway Broadcasting Corporation, Chicago's only Black and female-owned broadcasting company. Today, I proudly testify on behalf of the National Association of Broadcasters and thousands of free, over-the-air AM radio stations that serve your constituents across these United States. Your legislation to preserve AM radio in vehicles is critical. Every month, over 82 million Americans tune into AM radio for news, entertainment, sports, and emergency information. Over 15,000 radio stations operate in the United States, providing content to Americans for free on a daily basis. Of those, nearly 4,500 are AM radio stations. Midway operates two of these stations. The legendary WVON 1690 AM, The Talk of Chicago, is the oldest Black-oriented radio station in Chicago and has an urban talk format. WRLL 1450 AM, La Voz de la Comunidad Latina, is Chicago's home for Hispanic independent broadcasters. After 61 years, WVON has never strayed from our mission of providing live, local, and trusted content that empowers and educates Chicago's thriving diverse communities. We have stayed true to the reason the FCC granted our license, which is to serve the public. Our AM stations in Chicago are vital for many reasons, not the least of which is our social impact. One of many examples of our partnership with Cook County is our partnership with Cook County Treasurer Maria Pappas. Treasurer Pappas hosts a weekly segment that offers refunds to Cook County homeowners who have overpaid their property taxes. Thanks to this program, the treasurer has returned $300 million to taxpayers. AM outlets all over the country have similar stories of how they serve communities. AM radio is a resilient lifeline during public safety emergencies. To put it as simply as I can, the most foremost reason that Congress should care about AM radio is that it is a lifesaver. No other communications medium has the reach or resiliency of AM radio. A single station can be heard as far as 700 miles away. The signal cuts through buildings and mountains and remote areas where no cell signal or FM station can be found. AM is there. When the power goes out, radio stations can still be found on battery or crank radios or in your car. Broadcasters partner with the Department of Homeland Security to provide emergency information to the public. Americans also receive these alerts on TV, satellite, radio, and cell phones. However, we have seen in recent times how delicate our communications infrastructure can be. Just this past February, tens of thousands of mobile users lost service for hours, and it was a major national story. Our country has experienced national disasters, terrorist attacks, during which many means of communication were unavailable. When the power goes out and cell towers go down, Americans can depend on radio to provide them the emergency information they need. Additionally, 77 radio stations, a vast majority of those being AM, serve as primary entry point, or PEP stations, PEP stations. PEP stations are equipped to continue broadcasting information under all conditions. To put a finer point on it, these stations are still on the air when literally everything else goes down. Lives have been saved thanks to this network. In emergencies like the catastrophic wildfires in Washington state, Hurricanes Sandy, Ian, and Maria, or the tornadoes that just struck the Midwest last weekend and are headed there again in the next couple of days. Radio is the most reliable source of information Americans have access to. Support for this bill ranges from FEMA, DOT, and the FCC to over 75 organizations representing all stripes of Americans. I wish I had time here to list them all, but when 247 bipartisan members of the House and 60 senators have co-sponsored legislation, the case is compelling. In conclusion, Americans need fact-based, reliable information before, during, and after emergency events. Time and time again, AM radio is that critical lifeline. The federal government has a long history of advancing public safety in automobiles, from seat belts to airbags to backup cameras. Congress should do the same here, ensuring Americans' continued access to emergency information through their car radios as a safety feature. I commend this committee for advancing this important legislation and look forward to its passing. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Now I'll call on our next witness, John Bozzella, President and CEO of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. You're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
Chair Bill. There we go. Chair Bilirakis, Ranking Member Schakowsky, members of the committee. My name's John Bozzella. I'm the President and CEO of Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Thanks for the invitation to testify today and to share my perspective on legislation that would require automakers to install analog AM radio in all vehicles. We oppose this legislation, and let me explain why. First, requiring analog AM radio in vehicles is not necessary to ensure public safety. Second, it's an intervention by Congress to support a particular business model, in this case, advertising-supported analog AM broadcasting. And finally, it creates a troubling precedent at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Let me start with some context. There are 286 million vehicles on U.S. roads today. The average age, more than 12 years. 99% of those vehicles have analog AM radio. Even if every automaker discontinued analog AM radio starting at this moment, it would take more than 30 years for the fleet of vehicles to turn over and analog AM radio to fully phase out. A handful of automakers have announced plans to stop including analog AM radio in vehicles. Why? Customer research suggests that drivers rarely listen to analog AM radio in vehicles anymore. Today, they have lots of options to get news and entertainment while driving. Internet-based radio, streaming and satellite radio, as well as digital AM and FM radio. What about electric vehicles, which are about 1% of vehicles on the road today? EVs and AM radio, especially analog AM radio, don't always mix. The high-voltage electrical systems in EVs generate electromagnetic interference that, according to the Center for Automotive Research, quote, distorts AM radio signals, affecting the listening experience for drivers and passengers, unquote. In other words, really staticky. It's not possible to eliminate that interference, and techniques to reduce interference add weight and mess with battery range and would cost an estimated $3.8 billion. When we're talking about a small universe of vehicles and a transition that will stretch 30-plus years, ask yourself, what is this legislation trying to solve for? Why do this now? What's the rush? A few weeks ago, I was on the road, not tuned to AM radio, when my phone and dashboard blared with an alert. An earthquake occurred in New Jersey. I'm guessing many of us received the same alert on our mobile phones. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but this was a real-world example of a potential natural disaster while driving. The exact scenario analog AM radio mandate supporters say makes this bill essential. So what happens if a tornado or hurricane knocks out cell phone service while you're in a vehicle? First, automakers will continue to make alerts from FEMA's Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, IPAWS, available inside the vehicle on all platforms. And this is important. Those alerts will be available even if drivers don't subscribe to certain technologies. IPAWS alerts will be delivered at no cost to customers for free. Second, so customers can make informed decisions, automakers support a clear disclosure if a vehicle doesn't include analog AM radio. Third, if customers request it, automakers would support including an emergency portable AM radio in new vehicles that don't have analog AM radio, similar to the first aid or tire kits in new vehicles today. And because this transition will take 30 years, Congress has time to ask the GAO to study the issue and understand where analog AM radio fits into the government's overall emergency alert protocols. These are reasonable ways to address AM radio during emergencies, but stop short of full-blown government requirements. Finally, the question of precedent. Congress created NHTSA to be the country's traffic safety watchdog. The agency issues federal motor vehicle safety standards to reduce and prevent vehicle crashes, airbags, anti-lock brakes, emergency stability control, seat belts. Life-saving vehicle technology mandated by NHTSA after careful study of consumer acceptance and a rulemaking process with a cost-benefit analysis. That's completely missing from this debate. Instead, Congress is opening a new space for NHTSA to mandate vehicle equipment, any kind of equipment, that falls outside the vehicle safety lane. NHTSA should be a vehicle safety agency and an agency with boundaries. You could like AM radio mandates today, but you might not like the next equipment requirement from a future Congress under this authority. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is Justin Achestein, I hope I pronounced that right, the Executive Director of the Navajo Nation Office, Washington office. You're recognized, sir, for your testimony. 5 minutes, please.
Yat A, Chairman Bilirakis, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. She Justin Achestein yinshe, Aldonet Nishlunigi A Bilagana Nishle, Kotsene Basaschi Bilagana E Dashache, Nanak Isane E Dashanale. I serve as the Executive Director of the Navajo Nation Washington office, representing the President of the Navajo Nation, Dr. Boo Nygren. And he would like me to carry this message and remind everyone in the room that the United States, in accordance with tribal treaties, has a duty to ensure the safety and welfare of Native Americans in perpetuity with the treaties that we've signed. Access to reliable communication channels is a critical aspect of public safety, democracy, and community cohesion. For the Navajo Nation, AM radio has been and continues to be a vital lifeline that is woven through the fabric of our daily lives. In 1986, the Navajo Nation Council established KTNN, also known as the Voice of the Navajo Nation, to serve as the primary radio broadcaster for the Navajo people. Our one core motivation in starting the new radio station was to ensure Navajo elders who had limited English proficiency could receive important community announcements in the Navajo language. The Navajo Nation is large. Our reservation covers over 27,000 square miles, which is roughly the size of West Virginia. And our most remote residents are the most likely to communicate primarily in Navajo, necessitating the need for this radio service. For that reason, the decision from the beginning was to build KTNN as an AM station to ensure the signal reached as many Navajo citizens as possible. The FCC authorized KTNN to launch one of the last 500-watt stations on a clear channel in the United States. Now nearly every corner of the Navajo Nation can access KTNN during the day, and on a clear night, you can tune in from regular car radios from as far as Salt Lake City or Los Angeles. That is the power of AM radio. As this committee is aware, there are some significant differences between AM and FM radio signals. From a technological perspective, the difference is simple. AM varies the amplified of the signal, whereas FM varies the frequency. But the results are substantially different in terms of quality and reach. It's no secret that FM stations sound better. Most motorists, myself included, prefer listening to FM station if given the option. That's one reason KTN also broadcasts over FM. But even under the best of circumstances, FM stations can only broadcast out about 60 miles, and that's assuming you don't have a mountain in the way. This works great in the suburbs, but it becomes impractical when driving in places like the Navajo Nation. The KTNN FM signal doesn't extend much beyond Window Rock area, but the AM signal, though of lower sound quality, reaches across the entire Navajo Nation, nearly all 27,000 square miles. We would have to build dozens of radio towers across the Navajo Nation in order to get the kind of coverage with FM stations, which is economically impractical. The only real solution is AM radio. AM radio is not just for entertainment. Our people rely on AM radio for public safety updates. During an emergency, like the derailment that shut down Interstate 40 at the Arizona-New Mexico border this past week, AM radio allows our people to be warned of the danger before they've driven into it. A Navajo elder traveling 120 miles from Kayenta to Window Rock can be warned of a flash flood that's occurring in Chinle through an AM station and allowing them to plan an alternate route before it's too late. FM stations don't provide consistent coverage for the most part of that journey, and cell service is spotty at best. Satellite options like Sirius Radio are not only cost prohibitive, but they ignore local and regional issues that affect Navajo drivers and don't broadcast in the Navajo language. Additionally, the Navajo Nation radio station is crucial for providing emergency alerts through the public through a daisy chain system, ensuring that messages reach even the most remote and rural areas within our reservation. The far-reaching capabilities of AM transmitters, along with their resilience, are why our most remote communities across the reservation exclusively use and rely AM radio to stay informed with current world and local news in the Navajo language. That is why the Navajo Nation supports this bill. Life-saving information and public information should be readily accessible and not dependent solely on cellular networks, broadband, or satellite subscription-based services. In closing, I implore the members of this subcommittee to recognize the unique and indispensable role that AM radio plays for the Navajo people. As we work to bridge the digital divide, we cannot afford to undermine the existing tools that serve our community so effectively. Please consider the lifeline that AM radio represents to the Navajo Nation and other rural communities across America, and work with us to ensure that we will continue to have this accessible to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm open to answer any questions the subcommittee may have. Akehet, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Agustin. So now, thank you very much, all of you, for your testimony. I'll begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. First of all, in Florida, Category 4 or 5 hurricanes, like Hurricane Ian or the one that I mentioned earlier, Hurricane Michael in the Panhandle area of Florida, are unfortunately not uncommon. It's not an uncommon occurrence, and I know they're forecasting that the hurricane season will be pretty heavy. Hopefully that won't happen, and God forbid, anywhere in the United States. In the immediate aftermath of a storm or in the hours leading up to one, access to AM radio can be life-saving, as you said. There may be no electricity or cell signal available. Despite being a 100-year-old technology, AM radio is still a critical way for people to get information. No one can dispute that. Ms. Span Cooper, can you talk about how you have used AM radio in critical moments to disperse public safety information?
Yes, thank you for your inquiry. And you are 110% correct. It is so important. I think we're in the middle of the country, right? And so we don't get as many tornadoes and storms as some other places have. But we had a tornado that touched down in Plainfield not long ago, right? And the important thing about AM radio, and not just alerting people of storms, it is the fact that we are there before, during and after these storms. Think about in Florida, and I'm sure some of our AM stations serve your area the same way, Congressman. When you have things that are needed afterwards, Homeland Security, FEMA, things that information that people use when phones are down, when a lot of these towers come down, we are the broadcasters that's delivering that information. And so that's what makes it important. People talk about the alerts and people telling you where something is happening. We alerted you, but oftentimes when you see that on your cell phone, do you know what they're telling you? Turn on your local broadcaster. So they're leading you back to us in order for us and our team to give you the vital information that you need before, during, and after. That is why AM radio continues to be the backbone, especially in cases of emergencies, to serve these communities.
Thank you very much, and I know I don't have a lot of time, but the Chicago station that you referred to earlier,
Yes.
is that available on an FM station, the
No.
content? It's not available. right?
No, we are 2 AM stations, analog stations that are there. But when emergencies happens, it's important that everyone understands we are a PEP station. We have a PEP station in our market, WLS. So if something happens and the president needs to reach people, 90% of it is done through the PEP stations. Ours in Chicago, Congressman, is WLS, which sends the signals down to a station like WVON so we can reach our constituents. The country has done a wonderful job of shoring up the priority entry points, that's what they're called, for everybody to be able to reach this information. And so that is what we use. But by far, analog, carrying the message before, during, and after is where we really excel.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Achenstein, your community is largely based in rural areas, and I appreciate hearing your testimony on AM's importance. Would you like to share your perspective on the reliability of AM radio, particularly in times of emergency? And you did say that some of the content is available on FM stations, but it's not far-reaching, and you're representing the I can't even, I'm sorry, the entire nation. So in any case, go ahead and elaborate on that if you can, please.
Thank you, Chairman. So, I mean, the emergency notification systems, whether they go out and they're produced, I think there's one critical element that's missing from that, and that's being able to communicate the actual emergency in the native language. And that's something that, you know, a lot of these stations don't have, but that's what makes AM unique, because we have KTNN, which again is the voice of the Navajo Nation, and that would be able to communicate specific dangers in our native language. We're not talking about just the dangers, but you know, we're talking about weather alerts. You know, growing up on the Navajo Nation, my mother used to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning on a snow day, go into the car, warm it up, and she would listen for about an hour on weather alerts, because cellular reception and other things that most Americans have access to is not a reality on the Navajo Nation. We have areas that don't even have electricity or running water, let alone broadband services. So AM radio is something that people really rely on, and not everyone can afford a little radio within the stores, so they utilize what's available to them. And there was a comment mentioned that, you know, within the 12 years or so, you know, cars will be phasing out. Well, I don't think that really takes into account the terrain and the locality of our reservation, where we go through cars every 3 years or so, because cars are not equipped to handle the terrain that we live in. Most of our roads are unpaved. We have to travel through mud. We have to travel through, and it causes additional wear and tear on vehicles. So vehicles are a lifeline. And if vehicles that are available on market don't have AM radio within them, we're setting our people up for failure and potentially causing a public safety crisis worse than it already is on the Navajo Nation.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I apologize for mispronouncing Navajo Nation. All right, now we'll go to the ranking member and recognize her for 5 minutes of her 5 minutes for questioning.
Well, I want to take a moment just to welcome Melody Span Cooper, who is well-known in the Chicago area. And of course, WGN is, WVN. WVON is famous in Chicago. And she is a truly great entrepreneur in the field of broadcast, and AM is very, very important. And we've been talking a lot about the safety issues, but I wanted you to talk about, like WVN and others, you have 2 stations, what they mean in terms of the community and the connection that your stations have to bring the community together. And I just want to say that when it comes to women and blacks and Latinas, often are underrepresented, I think, and AM becomes very important. If you could talk about the community.
Sure, thank you so much. Our station went on the air 61 years ago, April 1st, 1963, as the WVON, the Voice of the Negro. That's in its call letters. And for the past 61 years, that's what we've been, a vital voice in Chicago representing its black constituents. And how do we serve them? Sure, we do entertainment, but we do caregiver seminars. We do senior breakfasts. I was so honored to help Congresswoman Robin Kelly with a campaign that she was doing on maternal mortality. She called, and we were able to drive that message for her. That's the value of these stations, and you find them down the Dow, Congresswoman Schakowsky, whether it's sports, whether it's religion. I think about Dennis Lal is here with me from the IBA. That's our big story in Chicago, because in Illinois, Chicago's the center of the universe, but it's really not to the farmers who are downstate. It's not to people who like conservative talk radio, who might live in Effingham or may live in Mound City. And so what AM has done and what we do at our stations, and what I'm so excited that we're now doing for our Latino community of Chicago, who's just thriving, is giving them an authentic voice to deal with those things that matter to them. That is what the FCC has given us these licenses for, is to serve communities. And you hear a lot of chatter around AM. I don't feel that way. I'm excited about AM. I'm excited about the dialogue we're able to have with these communities, and that we're able to serve and offer services and really show what our great nation is about in terms of its diversity and its voices. I've got 43 people who work with me. And we don't spend a lot of time talking about AM going out of business. We talk about AM and its connections to new technology and how we reach another generation of folks. So I'm not humdrum. I think it's a perfect, it is a tremendous foray for people who want to get in this business. Imagine my father having the opportunity to leave me this. So I'm excited about AM radio. I don't just have the same gloom and doom. I'm sorry, fellas, but.
So briefly, I know you were talking about the next generation, but I want to talk about, because I focus a lot on older Americans. Older Americans are important for the people who listen to you.
Yes.
A little talk about what you do for them.
Yes, thank you for that. Of course, when you have a legacy station that's 61 years old, the people have grown old with it, right? And we offer services on Medicaid, Medicare. They get conversations about this, about their health care, about their Social Security. We do a senior breakfast. I feed 1,000 senior citizens once a year. It's crazy. The seniors are just different. They dance, they get their blood pressures taken. This is the work that we do, caregiving workshops, education around banking, and not only seniors, Congresswoman, there is handicap accessible people who rely on us, right? I've had people call our station and say, what time is it?
Can I stop you for just a
Yeah,
second?
sure.
Because I do want to ask Mr. Hostin. Hosteen, are you basically saying that without AM, for many people in your community, in your tribe, that there will not be the communication?
That is exactly what I'm saying, Ranking Member. Broadband connectivity, even cellular connection on the Navajo Nation is difficult. There are areas on the nation that do have broadband. There are areas that have cellular connections, but traveling through the nation for the most part, I would say about 70% of the nation doesn't have access to these simple tools. And that's something that we're working to change, but it really doesn't help when a lot of the tools that we are dependent on to bridge the digital divide are being taken away. And one example specifically is I don't think that there has been reauthorization of the Affordable Connectivity Program that just gives Navajo people an opportunity to invest and obtain some of the equipment that's necessary, even just to connect to some of the services that are being offered.
My time is up, but I wanted to make that point. Thank you, appreciate you. And the reauthorization is important.
Thank you. I recognize now the chair of the full committee, Mrs. Rogers, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
I've long expressed concerns with the government mandating specific obligations for the private sector. However, we're at a moment where Congress's hand is being forced to intervene when corporations are choosing not to do what's in the best interest of the American people. In the case of AM radio, it's the auto industry. But sadly, we're seeing this in other instances as well. Another example is with big tech failing to protect the personal information of American people instead of choosing to exploit and monetize people's personal information. That is why we're working to enact a comprehensive data privacy and security law and ensure that people have the right to privacy and control over their information. I hope the takeaway from this hearing today for all companies is that they need to be thoughtful stewards of their products and balance innovating with what's best for consumers. And for today's hearing, that means how we preserve AM radio going forward. Ms. Span Cooper, we appreciate you being here and providing your expertise on how residents in the Chicago area rely on your programming for diverse and reliable information. I wanted to ask, if AM radios were removed from vehicles in the future, what effect will this have on the Americans who rely on these types of programs?
Thank you so much for your question. It would be a devastating effect on those that rely. They would be without a direct contact to vital information for their respective communities. It would, but more importantly, AM would just go away. And how unfortunate would that be? That you wouldn't be able to serve communities, that you would take something away that, number one, not only entertains, but is for safety purposes and more reliable than any of the sources that are available now. And it would just go away. And as great stewards, we shouldn't allow that to happen.
Thank you. Mr. Hosteen, we have federally recognized tribes in the state of Washington as well, and I appreciate you being here to share their voice. In your testimony, you spoke of various tribes across the country investing in tribally controlled stations to provide specific services to nations across the states. How would removing AM radios from vehicles impact the Navajo Nation, and are there concerns that voices would be silenced or access to life-saving public safety information would be lost?
That is a very real reality, and that is why the Navajo Nation is concerned about these steps to removing AM radio from vehicles. As I have stated in my testimony, broadband connectivity is very sparse. Cellular connections is very sparse across the nation. The only real reliable source is AM radio, and if folks are driving, they're not going to get a flash flood warning on their cell phones. One, because the cell phone that they probably have is not the latest and greatest smartphone, and then the second issue is if it's dependent upon cellular connectivity, you're just not going to receive that because the signals are not there. So there's no way you can push notifications, so you're intentionally driving into a hazard.
Thank you. How would you respond to those saying AM radio can still be accessed by those even without vehicles?
Well, I don't know how or what tools are going to be made available. For instance, satellite radio, there's usually, in order to even get satellite radio in vehicles, you have to pay for a subscription, and that's just cost prohibitive for a lot of our members. We're talking about an area that has about less than $20,000 in an annual household income. To expect people to purchase additional tools just to receive basic public information, I think is not in the best interest of our people.
Thank you. Mr. Bozella, does the Alliance for Automotive Innovation support providing AM radio in vehicles for free?
AM radio is currently in vehicles for free. We have already committed and will continue to commit to make sure that emergency broadcast, especially the iPause system, which we are big believers in and support greatly, will always be available on multiple platforms for free. There'll be no need for a subscription to hear an emergency broadcast.
Okay, am I hearing for other broadcasts, though, that there would be a fee?
No, not at all. 99% of vehicles on the road today have analog AM radio for free and FM radio for free and streaming services for free. That's going to continue. And I think over the next 30 years, there may be a gradual increase in the number of vehicles that don't have analog AM radio in it because of significant interference with high-tech safety and emission systems like EVs. But I'm telling you, if you look at the vehicles for sale today, over 90% of them have analog AM radio in it. I think it's important. If customers want it, they can get it.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I thank the gentlelady, and now I'll recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bilirakis. Let me just say that, again, that in emergency situations, the ability to send alerts and other information that reaches as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, is essential to saving lives, and access to AM radio is critical, in my opinion, in an emergency, particularly for people when they're in their cars. And we've heard from critics of this bill, the draft bill, that access to AM radio in cars is not necessary to protect public health because other communication channels such as streaming, cell phone, push notifications, or FM stations are able to take the place of AM broadcasting. However, we know that in hurricanes, fires, floods, and other emergency situations, those communications networks are often unreliable, and redundancies in our nation's emergency alert system ensure that when disaster strikes, American families can get public safety information, and AM radio is a crucial part of our nation's emergency alert system because of its unique reliability during natural and man-made disasters. Now, I have two questions of Mr. Cooper, and then I'm going to ask Mr. Abston a question. And some of this may be discussed, so feel free to just add maybe to what you've already said. Can you discuss, this is Ms. Span Cooper, can you discuss why AM radio and stations like your own are a critical piece of the emergency alerting system, and how Midway Broadcasting collaborates with public officials to ensure your listeners receive up-to-the-minute alerts when they need them most, if you would?
Sure. Again, AM radio is the backbone of the emergency broadcasting system. I know that you were from the great state of New Jersey, and you know what it was like when Superstorm Sandy came, and how devastating it was. Imagine cell towers down. Imagine the inability to reach some of the more technological spaces that we have now, and that's carrying. AM radio survives. Radio survives. Let's go to Maui, for an example. Can you imagine that? And we all know the devastation of what happened in Maui. Because of our PEP station, that was the only source of contact with people on that island. Because of radio, they were able to stay connected. And so that is what really shows the significance and the value of our EAS systems and stations like ours being able to connect. When you look at a city like Chicago, like I said, you don't have a lot. But when I think I was most effective? During COVID. During a pandemic when there was not a lot of information, we were there before, during, and after, carrying messaging to people about unemployment, about the SBA was on our station. So that is what I think people miss. We think about alarm, we think about emergencies in 30 seconds. It's not just 30 seconds for those that are in it. It's before, during, and after.
Well, let me just ask you also about electric vehicles. How does removing analog AM radio from electric vehicles make consumers less safe? And what are the long-term impacts this shift would have on ensuring Americans receive possible life-saving information?
You know, Congressman, interestingly enough, AM radio is already in 50% of EV vehicles. I don't know why it's so difficult to put it in the other 50%. AM just didn't show up. It's in vehicles. I have an EV vehicle, and I have to tell you, every other day, they're sending me a new upgrade. What is so difficult about putting AM radio in electric vehicles? I think that is what needs to be answered, and I think understanding how important it is to our infrastructure that it should be in every vehicle.
Well, thank you. Mr. Hastine, any additional hardships that members of the Navajo Nation face if AM broadcasting equipment was removed? I know you've talked about some. If you want to add to it, it's up to you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I mean, AM radio is literally just a lifeline for the Navajo people. That's all we have. Again, when we talk about broadband and connectivity, it's difficult to get that even set up. We don't have the infrastructure in place to support that, but we do have AM radio, and that's how people get their news. You start taking away programs that invest into broadband, well, that's going to deepen the digital divide. If you start taking away our only accessible way to travel with AM radio, I'm not sure what everyone else expects us to do to communicate with our folks, short of sending signals and carrier pigeons. Then that's really a problem for us. You know, it's unique. I'm not an expert on how vehicles are created or what goes into the design and implementation of that, but I am an expert on being Native American. And I can tell you that the stark reality on the Navajo Nation is we are the 1% that is going to be affected if AM radio is removed from cars. And that's, just receiving basic information and public safety notices and updates.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now I'll recognize the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Mr. Wahlberg, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. AM radio is a vital community service. I'm an avid listener and sometimes guest on our excellent local stations. WJR out of Detroit, WLEN, which is a FM station, but local to my own hometown, WWJ, WKHM, WCSR, AM radio is some of the last truly local content available. And preserving consumer access to that content is necessary. Satellite certainly won't advertise local stores in my district. I'm also a strong advocate for consumer choice. The customer should drive what companies do and what options they have for their products. And I know you all are listening. I've heard from many of my constituents, and they want to continue having AM radio in their vehicles. I think we can find a solution, at least I hope we can, find a solution that works for everyone but remains flexible for the future, because the future is flexible. Ms. Span Cooper, my district is quite rural. I grew up in Chicago, but I'm delighted to be living in a rural area now. One of the biggest problems in many areas is not having a reliable internet connection. Until we get connected, why is AM radio important to those communities, rural communities in particular?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. I think many of us assume that everybody lives in big cities like Chicago, and they don't. A wide swath of American people live in rural communities where the technology infrastructure may not be there, where they are underserved. People assume that we all have big cell phones. We don't. And so AM radio serves those constituents. It's their lifeline. And it's important to entertain them, sports, religion, talk, information for communities is there. But in cases where there are storms and critical things that happen, it is the backbone of those communities in terms of being in connection with those constituents.
Thank you. We all know that emergency alerts come through multiple devices. That's how they're supposed to work. My cell phone buzzes quite often. We're not always tuned into AM or FM radio, so the buzzing on our phones and TVs get our attention. Mr. Hosteen, what role does AM radio play after those initial alerts? I'm sure not all of your nation has flip phones, especially younger people. If the worst is to happen and wireless and broadcast service was disrupted nationwide, how does AM offer resiliency in times of disaster?
Thank you for that, Congressman. Really, I think I mentioned earlier, even if a notification is pushed through a phone, that notification is not being transmitted in our native language. And for a lot of our
That's what I
elders-
wanted you to say again. I mean, that is a very unique situation. I've heard you talk about all of the rest of it, but I wanted you to say that again, because a lot of us don't think that way. You know, I'm not expecting to be hearing things in Swedish. I wouldn't understand it anyway. But a Navajo Nation, how you've explained it there, that's important to understand. Thank you. I want to find a long-term solution. NHTSA has created a lot. I'm not sure we want to add to that without carefully thinking. Mr. Bozzella, I've experienced radio interference by just plugging in my cell phone into my car charger. Things are changing. What options are there to continue having full access to AM radio in vehicles, including those in times of emergency?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. First, 99% or more of vehicles in the marketplace today and on the road today have analog AM radio in them. So I think that's important to recognize. Customers have choices today. Beyond that, for the very few vehicles that maybe don't have analog AM radio in them today, we're going to make sure that if in front of any paywall and completely for free, that broadcast emergency alerts will come through. I want to also make sure you're aware and the committee is aware that we think customers should be notified at the point of sale about whether a car does have analog AM radio so that a customer can make an informed choice. And third, if customers want analog AM radio, Ms. Span Cooper mentioned crank and battery radios. I think those are incredibly important in emergencies where we're often told by FEMA to get out of the vehicle. Those types of products can be taken out of the vehicle in cases of emergency, and if customers want them, automakers are prepared to provide them in vehicles that don't have analog AM radio in them.
Thank you. My time has expired, but we will remember those commitments. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. The gentleman yields back. Now I recognize my fellow Tampa Bay member. We work together on several issues, including this one. Ms. Castor, you're recognized for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Bilirakis. Thank you for organizing this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses. Your testimony has been very illuminating. I think it's clear that AM radio is vital to our neighbors back home. It's not just the weather alerts and news and community updates. It's the entire package. And according to a Nielsen report that was published less than a year ago, radio continues to reach more American consumers than any other platform. Linear or digital, it reaches 91% of the U.S. population in a given month, including 91% of our black neighbors, 95% of our Hispanic neighbors, and I think a resource such as this should be protected. That's why I'm proud to sponsor the local Radio Freedom Act. It's a resolution that reaffirms Congress's support for local radio stations and opposes any new fees or taxes on local free broadcast radio. Radio, as Chair Bilirakis has noted, it is particularly important to my neighbors in Florida. We rely on it for critical information during hurricanes, and Ms. Span Cooper, you have emphasized it's not just at that time of crisis, it's in the aftermath, dealing with it that's so important. And as we, they think these storms are going to become even more intense. They're thinking of going to a Category 6. So I can't imagine that at this time we would go backwards in providing that important communications tool that you've called a lifesaver. In fact, this letter from 7 former Federal Emergency Management Agency directors caught my eye on this. They say FEMA has spent millions of taxpayer dollars in creating and bolstering the National Public Warning System to communicate with the public during times of crisis. It is powered principally by AM radio because it is the only communication system with the reach and the resiliency to ensure that elected leaders and public safety officials can communicate with the public under the worst conditions. Ms. Span Cooper, talk to us again about how you all interact with our emergency management officials during a time of crisis and in the aftermath.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Again, it's the priority entry point stations, PEP stations. It's over 70 of them across the country. In Chicago, WLS, 50,000 watt station. If the president needs to reach, if something happens and he needs to reach the American people, within 10 minutes, it's there. He is there. His message is going out. That station sends the information down to our station, right? And they're located throughout the country. The country did this following the terrorist attacks to shore up these stations to make sure they are the backbone of reaching 90% of Americans in case of an emergency. And so that's how it operates and how it falls down in order to reach stations across the country from this main big station in our area.
So some opponents of the legislation point to the test of the emergency alert system that took place last October. During this test, which was conducted under normal, non-emergency conditions, only a small percentage of Americans reported receiving the alert through AM radio. In your view, would the same be true during an actual disaster when internet, power, and cell service may be down?
Well, the PEP stations kind of cover that. Listen, we're glad to see technology participate in this process. All hands have to be on deck when it comes to an emergency, right? But for them to sound an alarm, to send them to your local broadcaster, tells you and further supports our premise that AM radio, analog radio, is important in times of emergencies. It is the most fail-proof operation that you can have, Congresswoman. It is the backbone of the emergency system.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and now what we'll do is we'll take a recess. We have votes, and I think there are 9 votes. So, but they will probably have a 2-minute amendment votes, so it won't take too long. So we'll reconvene 10 minutes after the last vote. Okay.
You're doing great. Well, you do better.
I'll reconvene the hearing, and I'm going to recognize, let's see, Mr. Duncan from the great state of South Carolina. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the chair of the Broadcaster Caucus, I'm a proud co-sponsor of legislation to ensure that all new vehicles in the United States continue to provide emergency service lifeline that is AM radio. In my district, AM radio is a source for Clemson football. Yay, go Tigers. Clemson radio, Christian radio, and conservative talk radio. That's a pretty strong combination. I want to follow up on to Ms. Span-Cooper on your answer to Ms. Schakowsky earlier, and just ask you, why are other communications media unable to replicate the reach and reliability of AM radio in times of emergency?
Thank you so much, Congressman, and thank you for chairing your role as chair of this. I've got to say that what makes us special is the fact that we are live, local, and trusted. Live, local, and trusted. Able to reach the people and communicate beyond an alarm, beyond a warning, and really go the distance before, during, and after these catastrophes in order to reach the constituents.
Thank you. Live, local, I love it. Mr. Adelstein, I'll just say this. I'm not going to ask you a question, but I appreciate your testimony and perspective that you brought to this hearing. I want to shift gears and ask Ms. Shapiro, with that in mind, in an op-ed you wrote after being trapped in California wildfires, you said this, and I'm going to quote, "We make ourselves incredibly vulnerable by relying on tech without some redundancy, also known as backup capabilities. In your recent advocacy, you seem to be calling for the elimination of this redundancy. Are you now saying that we're not vulnerable by relying on only streaming?"
Thank you so much for that question. I've been waiting for that. Any question, actually. I appreciate that. You know, I do believe redundancy is important. Look, I've written 4 books on innovation, over 1,100 articles. I speak about around the world. We run the most innovation-focused event in the world. It's the largest business event there is. My life is about innovation. But to mandate any innovation unless it's really for real safety purposes, I have a problem with. I believe in redundancy. That article, what I wrote there was about, first of all, it was about FM radio, and it was about the fact that you should have backups. I love the fact that there's the government says if for emergency kits you should have a wind-up radio. But I do want to correct a couple of things. One is that AM is not that different than FM unless it's at night and the skies are clear. Then there's a different amount of coverage. So when we talk about FM and AM, and I believe on the Navajo tribe, there's FM radio broadcasts as well. So unless it's nighttime with clear weather, it's pretty much the same coverage. And that's just a physical fact. And the second thing is...
But all emergencies don't happen during bright sunny days and morning and daylight hours.
You're absolutely correct. And that's why the average American has about 6 different technologies in their car to receive information and entertainment. And that's what I'm saying. So there's multiple sources out there, and the right one may not be for that emergency. There's no source, including AM, that's going to be up all the time. There are satellite, which has a national footprint. There's other great technologies which have the benefit of two-way communication, like CB radios, telephones, and family radios. Those are the type of things people should have in their cars.
I appreciate that, but in the essence of time, you also went on to say we were only able to get a radio signal by going to the parking lot and listening to car radios. We're able to arrange an earlier bus by driving to the bus dispatch office. Every group and facility should have a portable solar hand crank radio or a phone with a working FM radio option. Smartphone manufacturers should consider making FM radio available on devices when technically feasible, and even promote and market it as a safety feature for users. So why would you say that a smartphone should be allowed to have radio broadcasting but not electric vehicles when Americans are already accustomed to AM in their cars? AM broadcasting is already a bedrock of federal emergency management policy, and we've heard from the Navajo Nation. There are areas, I had property in Montana, where you couldn't really get good coverage from a satellite that you talk about, but you always get the local AM radio station. So do you acknowledge that there are times and places when and where people cannot stream media in their vehicles for whatever reason?
First of all, I want to make it clear, I'm not against AM radio. I think AM radio is great. I grew up with it. My favorite movie is Groundhog Day, but since that 30 years that movie came out where radio is a central feature, the sales of AM radios have dropped, non-vehicle AM radios have dropped 80%. Consumers are not choosing that device. When I ask younger people about AM radio, they think I'm talking about morning radio. They don't know what it is. And you're right, it's an older group, and I'm part of that group now, and I think that group's important. And I think AM radio is very important, and I'm not going to give it up, but I want it to be my choice and not mandated, especially when you have multiple other choices out there that do almost precisely the same thing, and in some cases better, in some cases not as good. That's all my point.
My time's up, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm now pleased to give my colleague and friend from Michigan the opportunity for her 5 minutes of questioning. Ms. Dingle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Here, the reality is AM radio right now, old or young, remains a key part of our nation's emergency alert system, providing crucial support during times of crisis and proving its reliability when other networks fail. As the automotive industry continues to evolve, we saw some announcements of some automakers to remove AM radios from the cars, raising significant concerns. Some of the CEOs very quickly reversed that. They're talking. Questions arise about the effectiveness of different types of emergency communications, the depth and quality of the information provided, free access to alerts, and the resilience of the infrastructure supporting these alerts. It's essential to ensure that all Americans can freely access life-saving information during emergencies through interconnected, innovative, and overlapping emergency communication services. That's a fact. But at the same time, we cannot undermine innovation. The United States has to stay competitive globally. So let me try to ask a lot of questions fast. This past October, FEMA and the FCC conducted a nationwide integrated public alert and warning system, IPOS test of the emergency alert system and wireless emergency alerts, which included alerts on TVs, radios, and cell phones. It reached millions of Americans. Ms. Cooper, how crucial is it to have a reliable emergency communication system in place, and what steps does this legislation take to improve and modernize the IPOS system?
There is nothing more important to the American people than to make sure that we have an apparatus in place that alerts us. What happened after the 9/11 and what the country did in shoring up these PEP stations to ensure that the president, no matter who he is, can reach the public, 90% of them through AM radio, is significant. It's important. The PEP. So that is the first line of defense. Any way that we can reach the public is important, but our ability to speak to them, not only while it's happening, before, during, and after, and no one does that better than AM radio.
Thank you. I think, again, it's important to reiterate the redundancy in our emergency communications is a crucial component. Mr. Bozzella, would this type of legislation be helpful in identifying what further investments or authorities are necessary to modernize and harden our emergency communications infrastructure and the ultimate impact on consumers?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman Dingell. First, I do think it is appropriate for government to continue to study as consumer tastes change and as technologies change, how we can effectively broadcast to the public. No one's taken away AM radio, certainly not the automakers. I'm an AM radio fan, so I think studying the question is important. I wouldn't first mandate a particular technology and then study it, as the bill does. So I think a study first makes good sense.
Thank you. I think it would be preemptive to consider a full mandate, but I also think it's preemptive to fully remove this technology from vehicles without getting the facts and examining the potential impacts. Switching gears, I'm grateful that the member companies of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation have committed to providing free emergency alert access to consumers. Mr. Bozzella, last year in front of this committee, the Alliance discussed the importance of access to safety information for consumers. Are your member companies committed to providing free access to emergency information to their customers?
Yes, we are. We did then, we are now, and we're committed to doing it in the future. We're also committing to making sure that customers are aware at the point of sale about cars that may not have analog AM radio receivers in them, so we're for disclosure. And we're also willing to, if customers want it, in cars that don't have analog AM radio, to provide an AM radio, a hand crank battery type AM radio for just the types of communications before, during, and after that Ms. Span Cooper talks about.
Thank you. Good. Consumers shouldn't have to pay access to life-saving emergency information. It's crucial that each company you represent makes clear how consumers will receive these alerts at no extra cost in these new vehicles. Mr. Bozzella, how would consumers receive emergency alerts when they're unable to access the internet when in their vehicles?
Yeah, so the vast majority of vehicles today have analog AM radio in them. More than 99% of vehicles today. More than 90% of vehicles for sale today have analog AM radio in them. So they will continue to have a multiplicity of platforms: digital, satellite, analog AM, and FM radio. No question about that. For the few vehicles that don't have analog AM radio receivers today, and customers want them, those companies will provide analog radios to support emergencies and broadcasting content both in and out of the vehicle. The content, I agree, is important, and no one wants to take that away.
Gentlelady's time has expired. And now I recognize the good doctor from Florida, Representative Dunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So I think, as we've all heard today, AM radio continues to be important to our constituents, offering a broad range of programming and essential emergency announcements, which are traditionally transmitted classically over the AM bands. Further, given the long wavelength of AM radio, we can hear these stations from hundreds of miles away, which makes it an ideal form of communication in emergencies and in rural settings. I'm going to give you a sense I have here that this feels like this is an almost urban versus rural bias. Now, if you live in a major metropolitan area, you're probably listening to FM or satellite radio. But in my rural district, you run out of FM coverage pretty quickly. And when the prominent lines of communications fail, as they did after Hurricane Michael in my district, when individuals can't access the internet, AM radio offers a reliable means of communication for warnings and whatnot. I can't particularly wrap my head around why we're trying to discuss getting rid of this critical fail-safe technology today. Well, we've heard from automotive representatives that electric vehicles generate electromagnetic interference, but there's 82 million people listening to AM radio every month. There's 2 million driving electric vehicles. So I think this is one we could leave alone. I want to get into the questions here. Mr. Shapiro, following the tornadoes hit my district earlier this year, much of our wireless infrastructure is still being rebuilt. This has left people, even in some of the more populated portions of my district, without cell phone connectivity all the time, depending on where their location is. Hurricane season is coming down on us, too. Some of my constituents may have unknowingly purchased vehicles that have removed access to their AM radio. How should you recommend, what do you recommend that they find life-saving information if they need that at a moment's notice?
Well, thank you, Dr. Dunn. And when we're talking about AM radio and all these receptions during emergencies and things like that, most of the time people are getting it at home. But for some reason, the auto manufacturers are being asked to foot the bill for the AM radio providers. There's so many different ways of getting AM radio, frankly, today, whether it's via satellite or via the internet. I know that my colleague here, I've listened to her radio station through the internet, as well as AM radio. But this is a solution in terms of a problem, because 98% of the top 100 vehicles models sold this past year had AM radio. The ones that don't, for the most part at this point, are a few electric vehicle companies like Tesla, because they've designed their car in such a way that it does not have AM radio. Now, there are 100 different Chinese manufacturers of cars, most of them focusing on an EV. They're getting way ahead of us. And that's a fact. And now while we're telling our car companies to make electric vehicles that they have to go back to the design board and go through several iterations to somehow figure out how they could take that very hostile environment of multiple batteries and say, you have to put this in there, even though, frankly, their consumers probably who are buying these very expensive electric cars to Tesla don't want it.
So, I think you can park the car and listen to the radio too. Ms. Span Cooper, I have a question for you. Do you think your listeners all have the ability to stream your stations, or are they listening over broadcast?
I think that some do stream, but a large swath of them still listen to the radio on the dial.
It's nice to have it free, frankly. So, Mr. Bozzella, how much revenue does the average auto manufacturer generate from apps and subscription services in the automobiles?
Yeah, so I don't have a specific industry-wide answer for you, but it's not a lot right now. That is not our business model.
Okay, so I was under the impression there was more money in that. Actually, to be honest, they seem to be chasing down a lot of data in automobiles. And when we went to the Right Repair Act, they certainly fought back on us no end because they wanted, the OEMs wanted the right to pursue that information.
Yeah, that's a different set of issues, which I'm happy to
Yeah,
discuss.
but with the money that's involved in that makes me wonder what the auto industry's motivation might actually be to drive their customers to apps and subscription services instead of free and unmonitored AM radio. That's just a thought I have. I leave that for you to think about. I don't have any statistics on it. Also, Mr. Bozzella, I mentioned earlier AM radio, which has 80 million listeners a month, and more. It has more listeners than everything else. Does it seem reasonable? Do we continue to provide that service at least for now? I mean, it seems great. You have the sense of Congress. We're not really willing to get rid of this.
I 100% agree with you. Here's what's happening today. Customers have choices. More than 99% of vehicles on the road today have analog AM radio. Well over 90%, you heard Mr. Shapiro give you a high number for vehicles sold last year, that are in the marketplace have analog AM radio. We are committed to disclosing to customers at the point of sale about vehicles that may not have it in it. I think customers should be informed. I think AM radio is important. I'm a big listener of AM radio, and we're not about taking it away.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I recognize the gentlelady from Illinois who represents the district where I bought my first AM radio.
Calumet City. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the witnesses. Ensuring diverse voices are able to engage in a changing media landscape is a priority of mine. Representation really matters, and I'm thankful for Melody Span Cooper and Mr. Hosteen for your participation in this important conversation. And like was said, her radio station helped me with my maternal mortality legislation, but also has done PSAs when I did it around crib deaths and crib bumpers and things like that. So I'm very grateful to stations in the Chicagoland area such as WVON, WRLL for serving as a trusted source for news, entertainment, education throughout the Chicagoland market. And Mr. Hosteen, you alluded to how Navajo Nation uses their cars and gets their information. Ms. Melody Span Cooper, can you talk about the importance to the community you serve to be able to access AM radio from their cars? Because when I've been on the show, you have a tremendous listening audience from the car.
Thank you, and it is important that we, of course, keep it in the cars for the entertainment purposes, but also in cases of emergency. I think about your district and how we assisted. Not long ago, there was a flood where people lost a lot of their, home furnishings in basements, and how, and on the west side of Chicago, and how our station really opened up for you, for FEMA, for others to get information on how to get these services. Quite frankly, people spend a lot of time in their automobiles, right? They're in the house, they've got other options. Think about it, in your car, you've got one option pretty much to connect. And in those emergency situations, it's It's radio, and it's good to know, Congresswoman, that there's a place that you can go and you can get the information you need. I think about another example, too. Recently, Congressman Jackson had a water crisis in his district. And we even went one step further in getting people the information that they needed, but providing a place on our website where they can put in their zip code to find out if their area was damaged, in addition to what we were sharing, right? And so again, this is important for not only during the storm or before the storm happens, but really taking people from nuts to bolts and assisting the American public in times of crisis.
But even in times that are not crisis or emergency, it just seems like you're trusted sources for people, period. So that's the other thing. What would be the economic, I guess, consequences if this, were to go forward?
Well,
Not knowing, I know you guys are saying you don't mean that, but just.
right. In addition to, I'm sorry.
No, both of you. You can go first.
So in addition to being a broadcaster, we're business people. We employ people. 43 folks own homes, send their kids to school, do what you do as an American. And they be out to pasture, but here's even a bigger lens than the employees, is the service, the public service that we provide for our constituencies in the Black and brown communities around Chicago.
Mr. Hostin?
From an economic perspective, the Navajo Nation created KTNN as one of our very many successful tribal enterprises. So it does, in a sense, help support the Navajo economy, but I think what we really are focused on is making sure that the people are getting information to them in the language that they understand and can ascertain. Listening to English, especially if let's say there's a natural disaster and President Biden makes a speech and whatnot, and that's broadcasted over the AM network, well, you're going to have a large percentage of Navajos not understand what's going on. But at least after the speech, we have someone who speaks Navajo who can transmit that message immediately after, so folks understand what's going on and what's happening in the world.
Thank you. And Mr. Shapiro, a reasonable man, I know. What do you see any happy medium or?
Yes, I do, actually, in a number of different ways. I think we all agree that AM radio is very important in providing a service to the public. It does have some noise issues and some signal issues, but we've had a long-standing commitment, a committee with the National Association of Broadcasters, and we agree on technical specifications to improve those. The reality is we've never disagreed on when we come out with the final result, because it's by consensus and their engineers are working together to solve a problem. The difference is every time we've tried and the engineers have agreed, it hasn't been implemented. So AM radio has suffered market share because of its technical capabilities. But there's ways of improving that, going digital, going streaming, others. AM should and will survive. But I think this is a solution in search of a problem. There's I'd love to find someone who bought a car and a Tesla and didn't know that it didn't have AM radio, and there's plugins, there's ways of getting around it, there's other sources getting into the car. So I just don't understand why there has to be a mandate, and that's where I disagree with my colleagues on this panel, at least two of them, because the mandate to me in this area and getting in safety standards from an automobile and opening up this whole new area is dangerous, and it hurts U.S. competition globally in electric vehicles.
Thank you so much. And I yield back, no time.
Thank you. Back. Appreciate now recognize Ms. Lesko from the great state of Arizona, and we're going to miss you. What a great member she is. I recognize you for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You still have to put up with me for 8 months. First of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Hostin, for being here today and explaining to us why AM radio is important for the Navajo Nation, because I didn't know that before, and I'm glad that you're from Arizona, because that's my great state. And so we live in a wonderful state. For those of you that haven't visited, you need to come now before it gets too hot. My first question is for Mr. Bozzella. I think you said something to the effect of EVs, electric vehicles, and analog AM don't always mix. Yet about half of the EV car companies are now putting in the AM radio, installing the AM radio. And so can you tell me, if they can do it, why can't all of the EV manufacturers do it?
Yes, thanks. It's a great question. So not every manufacturer have the same platforms, the same technology arrays, and the same approaches to designing vehicles. And so some companies, because of how they've built the vehicles and how they've arrayed their batteries, their battery management systems, and their motors, are maybe more capable of doing the type of shielding and the type of work required to be able to address the interference issues. There's no question, nobody disputes that there's interference issues. The question is, how do you address them? I do think that in the future, you could see other companies sort of making those same investments, but I think the most important aspect of this bill is this bill takes AM and it puts it ahead of every other technology investment and safety investment an automaker needs to make. And so you have to account for that first and then deal with the other trade-offs that are related to safety and emissions. I don't think that that's the best approach. I do think your broader point, though, is right, which is there are ways for manufacturers to address this. It takes time and it takes money, and I think we can respond to customer needs.
And that's my next question. Two of the things that you've brought up, and I think Mr. Shapiro's brought up, is cost and weight.
Yeah.
How much more does it cost, and how much weight does it add to the vehicle?
Yeah, so the cost issue is $3.8 billion between now, $3.8 billion.
But per car?
Per car, it varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. And because...
Do you have an estimate?
I don't, because
because that's what I care about is per car. Yeah.
Okay, well, you could take $3.8 billion and divide it by about 15 million vehicles a year. The issue is not solely cost. The issue, as I said, is this is not a federal motor vehicle safety standard. This is a mandate separate and apart from that. Now, with regard to weight...
Just because I have a time limit, I'm sorry. How much is the weight per car?
I don't know. I'll get back to you.
Well, you said it's a
fight over ounces.
It's a big
We fight over
concern.
ounces to make sure.
Yeah, if you guys could get back to me
Sure, I'd be
the
happy.
extra cost per car and the extra weight per car, so I can judge. Is this a big deal? Is it not a
100%.
big deal? Is this just
Happy
something
to
you're
help.
saying to oppose it? I just don't know.
Yeah.
My next question is for Mr. Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro, in my home state of Arizona and in my congressional district, I have a lot of senior citizens, And they don't, I think one of the alternatives to AM radio is, well, you could stream the content, right? Well, I don't know, first of all, if they purchase services to stream, and I don't know if, I'm thinking of my 94-year-old mother, right? She's not going to know how to do this. So what do you say to those people?
I say they're my peers. I'm a senior citizen.
You don't look 94, man. You're a lot younger than that.
I thought people didn't think I was 100 because I'm wearing the pin about the age of our association. But the reality is, you're right. It's tougher for older people, but 99.9% of the cars they're likely to buy have AM radio in it. So this is a solution in search of a problem. So that's what I would say to them. The car makers have agreed to say we're going to disclose very conspicuously. If it doesn't have an AM radio, you're not going to see a lot of those except on electric cars. And there are choices in electric cars now. Mr. Brazell is right. It depends how they design the car. Some cars design differently, but it is the most hostile environment you can imagine. If you read one document as a result of this, I urge you to read the Center for Automotive Research report that was done, and it lays out the cost, it lays out why it costs more, and it lays out the complexity of solving a problem like this, especially if your original design said we could solve problems by not having AM radio in this car, and that would make us more efficient. It's a total redesign for a car like Tesla. And for the smaller companies, it may just drive them out of business, American companies that are trying to break into the electric car market.
Well, and I thank you, Ms. Span Cooper, for being here. I've run out of time to ask you a question, but you did a great job. So thank you all for being here and testifying, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Now I'll recognize the gentleman from Florida, my good friend, Mr. Soto. You're recognized for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. AM radio is part of everyday life in Central Florida. We have every day hundreds of thousands of Central Florida commuters going on I-4, 417, 528, 408, and more. The good news is, thanks to the infrastructure law, they're going to be spending a little less time in traffic. They're also listening to local FM and AM radio stations, local radio with local content about our region. Sports, politics, faith-based, and more discussed every day on these stations. And this is especially true in the Hispanic community as well as among our seniors and folks from rural areas. And one of the reasons why we see higher both minority and rural ownership of these AM stations is because it's a cheaper access to entry, right, than an FM station, and it's harder to get on some of these national satellite radio programs because it's all national. And if you're not one of the bigger players, it's difficult to get some of these local voices on here. So while AM radio is helpful on a daily basis in Central Florida, it's essential during hurricane season. When the power's out and cell phones are dead, people turn on battery-powered radio if they're prepared. If not, the reality is they start their cars and turn on the radio when all else fails. Ms. Span Cooper, how's the reception of AM radio in your electric vehicle? You said you drive an EV.
The reception is great.
Okay.
I don't have a problem in the car that I have.
Okay.
And since this is the mood that Congressman Soto, that they're taking, if 50% of the automobiles that are already EV has AM radio in them, then what is wrong with the other 50%? My colleague to my left talked about, that they would give crank radios. So in the middle of an emergency, I assume we're supposed to get our car, go in the trunk, get a crank radio and start it. That's just not feasible when people are in an emergency. And so since we are at this point when we were talking about the dollars that were necessary to do it, some studies say it's minimal for them to do it, right? And so that is why it's important that we look at going to 100% on EV for AM.
Thank you, Ms. Span Cooper. Nearly 10% of new cars that are purchased are electric vehicles. In Florida, we're actually above the curve. We have a interesting state in that way. A lot of solar, a lot of EV vehicles, even as we have interesting politics. I was excited to vote for the Inflation Reduction Act, which helped make this possible. In my district, we have the first used vehicle refurbishment Tesla dealership in the nation. We're getting the largest charging station in the nation, also in my district in Yeehaw Junction. Yes, that is a place. But the average vehicle is about 10 years old. So as we're talking, Ms. Span Cooper, about the future of AM businesses as we get to 10, 15 years down the line, how does that look over the next 2 to 3 years about securing capital or advertising, or over the next 5 years or 8 years as this increases in market share, like we hope it does? What would that mean for your business and other AM businesses? Would it make it more difficult to keep the doors open?
It is difficult, Congressman Soto, but what I think people really are leaning into on a station like mine is live, local, trusted. There is a need to reach local communities, and that is what advertisers are leaning into now. That is their bread and butter, is being able to connect with communities, and nobody does that better than radio.
One of the other things that concerns me is with social media, the internet, with national news, and with satellite radios, there's a growing nationalization of our culture, right? Citizens know the latest congressional intrigue or White House intrigue, but they may not even know their own school board member or what's happening with sanitation or clean water or clean air or the local economy or the environment. So, Ms. Span Cooper, how important do you think AM radio is for a locally informed citizenry? Making sure that we give every chance to have our local citizens understand what's happening in their backyards.
I think it's so important. It's our life's work. It's social impact. It's the ability to reach these communities, whether through entertainment, sports, religion, talk, however you reach them. But more importantly, Mr. Soto, when you look at the emergency infrastructure, for what I'm sitting here representing, it's 360, because that is as important than anything when it comes to the safety of our people.
Well, I've experienced Hurricane Ian. My family's native island of Puerto Rico experienced Hurricane Maria, where AM radio was the only thing that people can rely on. We heard Mr. Hastine talk about the importance of it in native languages during emergencies. And so as we find our way through and navigate, and thank you, Mr. Bazell, for talking about the weight and the cost, because that was going to be one of my questions. So way to go, Ms. Lesko, for bringing that up. We're going to be looking to all these factors and appreciate your testimony here today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentleman. Yields back now. I do want to, if you can get that information to us, sir, with regard to the weight, because I think everyone's interested
Yes,
in
will do.
the bottom line per car estimate, if you can, please. Okay. All right, next we have Representative Falter. You're recognized for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think I'm going to be brief here because my questions have been answered, but I do want to make a comment, and I do have a question. But I recently read an article, May 23 of year 23, in Car and Driver magazine, and it was with the CEO of Ford, Jim Farley, and this issue was the front and center of that discussion. And after hearing your testimony, in particular from Mr. Shapiro and Mr. Bozzella, on the quantum leap that you say is necessary and the ordeal that this is for manufacturers, I'm wondering if Ford is just that far superior over everybody else, because they seem to have figured it out. And I know the arguments of different platforms and all that kind of stuff, but it's an AM radio. And so I'm just communicating, I'm struggling with your responses and your testimony. And I've read it and I heard it. And so it's not like I'm ignoring that. But so just, that's an editorial comment. I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure I'm totally buying off on it, okay? The other thing I want to say, and there is a question embedded with this, is last weekend I had the privilege of driving from Kamei, Idaho to Orofino, Idaho, on up through the Palouse to Spokane Airport. Some of the most gorgeous country you have ever seen, and I'm biased. It's my home turf. I love it, but it doesn't get any more beautiful. The Clearwater River, you track that thing, and it's clear water for a reason. But I couldn't get any FM signal. I couldn't use my cell phone. For a lot, there's patches where you can. But the AM signal comes through loud and clear. So my question, and I'll go to Mr. Shapiro and Mr. Bozzella because I took an inadvertent crack at you on the front end of this. What do I go tell my rural people in Orofino, Kamei, when that's the only thing they got?
Thank you for the question, and I haven't read the Car and Driver article, but I certainly will follow up and read it and probably get a written response to you. Mr. Farley is obviously a leader of a major company, and each of the companies make their own decisions on what they introduce. And we stay away from that. That's the antitrust laws, and I respect those. But what I do think, in response to your question, is there are other choices. There's satellite radio. There's obviously other ways of getting music, if you can get an internet signal, which you clearly can't if it's cellular-based. But there's different ways to do it. But right now, what we're saying is there's a battle for the eardrums. It's actually the name of a speech I gave to the NAB in 1997. And I said, you got to get your technical act together. And it's what's going on this issue, though, is you're putting one medium ahead of every other medium, and you're trying to make it a safety issue when there's no research and there's no data showing it is a safety issue. And that's what we're asking.
Excuse me, if I can. It's a safety issue if you can't get it.
Well, you're
you can't
saying
get
that
the message. That's a safety issue.
Well, it takes a very weird collection of things to occur before that situation will occur. Most of the time, people are not in their car when there's a major thing. They're usually at home, and there's no requirement in this legislation for AM radio at home or in a store or in a college campus or anywhere that people congregate. It's just
But
in the
Mr.
car.
Shapiro, vehicles are mobile. That's part of the point. And so.
Well, so are motorcycles, and you have to have that AM radio
If you
on.
cannot get a signal, if you cannot get communication, I would say there's a safety issue.
No, but you also have to have the AM radio on to even know that there's a problem. And you have to not have your satellite radio on, which is probably telling you there's a problem or some other way to get into the car. So my point is, it's a very, and there has to be an AM radio broadcaster physically in the station telling you there's a
So
problem.
go back to my question because I'm running out of time. What do I tell my people in Orofino and Kamei?
Tell them that there's no problem because they could buy cars with AM radio stations now so easily, like 99%.
All right, Mr. Bozzella.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. I would say that for now and the foreseeable future, your constituents will be able to buy a car with an analog AM radio. And what I would also say to your constituents is what you've heard at this hearing is that automakers are now committed to informing customers at the point of sale regarding any car that doesn't have it in it. And so what you've done today is you've improved consumer awareness about the few cars that don't have AM analog radio in it. And if I lived in that district, I would buy a car with analog AM radio in it.
Thank you, Mr. Bozzella. Mr. Chairman,
Thank
go
you,
back.
sir.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman yields back. We'll recognize Mr. Obenalty for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
Thanks for your patience.
Absolutely. Thank you to our witnesses. I have to say, I am really conflicted on this topic because I'm a fan of AM radio. I know many of my constituents rely on it for news and information. And I'm very sensitive to the argument that it's a vital safety connection with the citizens of the United States. On the other hand, I'm not generally a fan of using the heavy hand of government regulation to force consumers to spend money. And that's what this bill would do. Now, one of the things I'm a little disappointed that we haven't been able to nail down is the actual cost that we would be imposing on consumers through this. This is not the first hearing that this issue has received. In fact, other committees that I serve on have had hearings on this issue. In those hearings, it's been estimated that it's at least $50 in an internal combustion engine vehicle. When Congresswoman Lesko was asking about this, I think you said it was 3.8 billion vehicles divided by, or $1 billion divided by 15 million vehicles. Back of the envelope math says that's about $250 a vehicle.
Per year.
Per
yes.
year.
Mm-hmm.
Right. For the,
Yep.
So, but I'm talking about what cost are we imposing on consumers? So, I mean, something between $50 and $250.
Yeah, we owe you that, and
Okay.
we will provide you that.
Right, but I mean, it's not nothing, and it's not pennies. It's,
No.
you know, it's, no one has suggested it's less than an incremental cost of $50 per vehicle. So this is the problem that I have, is how do I go to my constituents and tell them that we are forcing them to spend $50 on something that they may not want? And that's where I really start to struggle with this issue. So I want to focus on the issue of emergency communications, because to me, that's the compelling, the only really compelling argument that would justify forcing consumers to do that. And Mr. Pizzella, this question's for you because you were talking about how AM radio is an outdated technology for emergency communications. And when I think about the limitations of AM, and I look at what we have now, we've got low Earth orbit satellites that are just amazing. We've got most of the Earth covered at this point. The receivers are getting smaller and smaller. Certainly a lot of phones these days have satellite communications built in. My new iPhone does. It's for emergencies only, but I can use it that way. And it has a compelling advantage because it's two-way, right? I can call out if I say, hey, there's someone injured here, please come get us, instead of just getting a message you know, that is broadcast to everybody. And the converse is also true. If someone wants to broadcast a message just straight to me, hey, your mother's had a medical problem, you need to get back to civilization, they can do that. So it's got some compelling advantages. Why on earth would we force people to invest in an older technology instead of, if this was really our concern, trying to build out a new technology that has those advantages?
Yeah, I think that's an essential question, and I think that's why, you know, I believe that the idea of a study here is so important. And I think because, and look, if you look at the FEMA, you know, you instructed FEMA to do an analysis and work on modernization. They concluded that a multiplicity of platforms is where we have to go. The FCC also, the Federal Communications Commission, in their report and order from 2020 said the same thing. You know, what's happening is AM analog is declining, and so therefore we need a multiplicity of platforms. We're not here to say that AM analog doesn't have a role, but your point is critical, which is we need a multiplicity of platforms depending on both current and new technology to ensure that people are prepared and informed in an emergency.
Right, all right, well, thank you. And if I could amplify Congresswoman Lesko's request.
Yes.
Because that information is really critical as we weigh this decision, the exact costs that our consumers are going to be asked to bear, and understanding that it's different for internal combustion engines and electric vehicles,
Yes.
probably much higher for electric vehicles, and also the weight penalty for EVs, that would be helpful. Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield
The
back.
gentleman yields back. Yeah, we need that information. There's no question to make decisions, no question. All right, I'm going to recognize Representative Armstrong for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Anybody know if the cost for the AM radio in a Tesla is more or less than the $7,500 rebate? No, I'm asking. Because we're acting like this is a free market, and it's not. And with all due respect to my friends who live in more populated areas, AM radio is still the best way to find out if a tornado is coming before you get on the highway and drive 150 miles in North Dakota or New Mexico. And I don't particularly care how much it costs, because it might work somewhere, and it might work with low orbit satellite technology. All of those things might be great. But until they exist in a meaningful way, when you live in a place that has hail, tornadoes, floods, blizzards, all of those different things, but you also have a low population base. So if you you have an entire federal government that is proposing, mandating, moving towards electric vehicles. I come from a place that, just to be honest, Ford, Toyota, Chevy, they care a lot more about their sales in California and whatever California is doing than they care about Tioga, North Dakota. But you know what? We need all that stuff in Tioga, North Dakota. It's the only thing we have. And you know what you have in your house when something goes on? Public broadcasting, which tells you in a very loud, everybody knows, Wednesday night, you get the thing on your TV that says, this is a test of the public broadcasting service. And you know when you turn on your radio in North Dakota? When you look outside and be like, wow, that looks bad. Or before you get out of your house to drive 150 miles. And if you allow electric vehicles to have the choice as whether or not they have AM radio, at the same time you're mandating more electric vehicles. I'm gonna have 19 people at a quick charging station, at the dumbest quick charging station maybe in America, which is between Bismarck and Dickinson, waiting because there's two of them, but only one of them's broken down. Because this is exactly what's going on. And they're gonna look outside and they're gonna be like, oh, I don't have cell service. I don't get FM. And I don't have any idea if this is just a cloud that I got to worry about or if this is something really serious and we all got to climb into the one car that's already charged and drive 40 miles home. No matter how big any of this stuff gets, they're not going to cover the Dickinson Rough Riders baseball team. And until the technology exists to allow my constituents to actually get this information in a meaningful way, the economy of the government regulation and mandates, by the way, on population of where these vehicles are sold, is going to take that choice away from North Dakotans. That's the model. Like, that's the model that exists. And you can say you can continue to buy a car with AM radio, and you can do all of that, but if you give all of these things the different versions of where this goes, you're gonna have all of these different things that happen. So you probably don't have the winners we have, Mr. Austin, but in AM radio being important in North Dakota, I understand that your testimony, only about 4% of your people have access to quality internet?
That is correct, Congressman.
And they rely on AM radio for crucial public safety updates?
That is correct.
And there are times where our nation will have public safety emergencies like train derailment, shutdown on I-40 in the Arizona-New Mexico border. I think it just happened this week, right?
That is correct, Congressman.
So driving in the Navajo Nation sounds a little bit like driving in North Dakota. Is maintaining the AM emergency broadcast system in every car crucial to ensuring every method of mass communication possible is built into the IPOS system?
Yes.
We have these multiple pathways, so many of my constituents in North Dakota aren't left behind in the event of a national attack or weather event. And I get it, in a city and an urban area, which by the way is where you sell most of your cars, you have access to all of these other things. But rather than an AM radio requirement being a solution in search of a problem, the problem is the increasing mandates for EVs and the emission standards that come with them. These mandates cause additional manufacturing difficulties for auto manufacturers. There's a rule out right now that's going to force all of my heavy ton farm trucks in North Dakota to be electric. Like outside of being, the truck already costs 3 times more. Put a radio in it. Like it's 3.5 times more expensive. It's 800 to 2,500 pounds more heavier. So I can haul 800 pounds less potatoes. It takes me twice as long to deliver them in Minnesota. Your French fries all get more expensive. And none of that goes back to my potato farmer in Grafton. The least we could do is let him listen to the local American Legion baseball game while he's doing it. I mean, these are all the things that are happening right now. So when you sit here and we have these conversations, I'm like, build the technology. When low orbit satellites are allowed to do all of this, I'm in. Whatever is the best way to communicate with my constituents, I'm all for it. But where we're at in my state right now, it's AM radio. And we don't have the population base to have a functional, competitive spot in the market. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Gentleman yields back. We're waiting for Mr. Carter. He's on his way. Hey, let me just ask y'all again, why not? I mean, you're hearing from our constituents. I mean, you're hearing from us. We represent our constituents. People want AM radio. There's no question. Ford, I guess Ford was decided to keep the AM radio, at least for now. There's nobody here from Ford to testify today. But why not? I mean, why is it so difficult? Just like Mr. Armstrong said, why is this such a big issue when our constituents really want it for emergency purposes, but they also want it for entertainment purposes? So answer that question. I mean, I know we're going to get the cost estimate and what have you, but he's right. I mean, Armstrong was right about the cost of the vehicle, buying a truck. I mean, a 150, one of the best, Tom Brady's favorite car. But why not just keep it in there at no cost to the consumer?
Yeah. So I'll take that on.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question.
Sure.
It's a competitive marketplace. Some companies are going to respond to your question in the following way. We're going to keep it in, and we're going to continue to do it, and we're going to manage the interference by masking, building cladding and doing those types of things. The challenge here is vehicles today are going to increasingly require much higher voltage. And so that higher voltage, whether it's higher voltage to support sensing capabilities for advanced safety features, or it's voltage to support electrification, is going to create interference. And so the question's just how you deal with that. And it's also about the future. Here's an important thing to keep in mind. The companies that are competing today in the U.S. market are also competing around the world. And one of the challenges they have is producing more efficient, longer range batteries so that vehicles can go further on a charge. That's going to require more voltage. It's going to require investments in motors. That's just going to create more interference. So that's the dilemma. So companies are going to respond to that dilemma in different ways. That's a competitive marketplace. I do believe, as I said earlier, that AM radio, analog AM radio, is going to be available in the U.S. market for a long time to come. To the extent that you need to study the questions today about emergency access, I think you should do that. And we'll continue to be supportive of that work because it's essential that these communications happen. But really, this is about innovation. And it's about competition.
Mr. Carter's coming back right now, but again, the lady, distinguished gentlewoman, Melody, she testified that she has an EV. She has an EV, and there's no interference currently. I don't know. You want to tell me what type of car you can? If it's up to you. But what do you say to that?
Yeah. So as I said, there are EVs in the marketplace that have AM radios. I don't know what EV she drives. I drive an EV, and it has an analog AM radio.
Do you have any problems with it?
Occasionally, but it's, I have problems with AM radio. And
Well, yeah, we have problems with, every day we have problems.
I mean, it's just the reality of AM radio.
The signal is always difficult. You try to get a baseball game, and it's very difficult at night.
I feel your pain, but mostly because my team is not so good. But in any event, just quickly, companies are going to take different approaches. And what you want to do is encourage innovation. Encourage innovation, and let's make sure that customers are aware of what technologies are in their vehicles and that we allow companies to be competitive. I appreciate the economic value of AM radio. The auto industry represents 10 million jobs in states all across America. For every dollar an auto manufacturer invests in a job, $3.45 of economic value is created. This is an economic and national security industry focused on cutting-edge technology, and we want to continue to provide that for the
All right, well, thank you very much. Mr. Carter has arrived, so I'm going to recognize him for 5 minutes of questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate y'all waiting on me. I promise you I'll try to be as succinct as I can. I represent South Georgia. I represent the entire coast of Georgia, all the way from South Carolina state line down to the Florida state line. Obviously, South Georgia, the southern United States, hurricanes, a big problem, natural disasters. I want to tell you the story of a fire that happened at a chemical plant last year in my district. It was a massive fire in Brunswick, Georgia, in Glenn County, and it resulted in evacuations. Luckily, WGIG-AM covered the fire live on air and provided urgent messages and updates from emergency officials to the residents. This was invaluable, as you can quite imagine. As I say, we've been through hurricanes. I've lived there all my life, and I know we depend on the emergency radio network for updates during the hurricanes, and certainly we depended on AM radio during this evacuation as well. Ms. Pam Cooper, I want to ask you, can you explain how and why the AM radio band is the most resilient band, which can withstand inclement weather events or fires like the one that we had in my district?
Sure. Because it works on an analog system, and because it's able to go past mountains, and we have this tremendous PEP process that was put in place after 9/11, where the country actually invested in AM stations, in radio stations, over 70 of them, sir, which carry the signal, and we're able to get this information to all of the constituents at any given time. Because of this radio emergency system, the President of the United States is able to reach 90% of the American
90%?
90% of the American population with instruction. Nobody else has that. They can alarm you that there's a fire. They can alarm you that something bad is happening. They don't have the ability to talk and give instruction to the American people. The reason you love that station, it's live, it's local, it's trusted.
Absolutely. Can you expand a little bit on the coordination between AM broadcasters and the local emergency personnel? I know, look, I see it in my district, and I encourage it, and I witness it, and that is the relationship that the emergency personnel and the AM broadcasters have.
Public safety community is very supportive of AM stations. I see the fire officials walking around and talking on the Hill, and that's a great thing. They are supportive. In Chicago, where we are, monthly, the police, the head of the police is on communicating with the public. Our fire commissioner, Colette Halt, a regular on our station. The great thing about AM, outside of a warning, is it is there at the beginning, the middle, and the end of these conversations and talking to constituents in these towns. That's something that this technology cannot do.
Great.
Can I just...
Sure, you're welcome.
So my understanding is that there's no reason that the primary entry point stations need to be AM stations. In fact, they could be any transmitter, TV, FM, satellite, could be your primary source for alerts. And the mandate that Congress put on our federal government with the EAS system is that it must reach 90% of the population, which it's doing under this combination of different stations as entry points.
Can I respond
Yeah, absolutely.
to that? One of the reasons why the AM is important, Mr. Shapiro and Congressman, is if you think back to 9/11 when the towers went down, FM signals are on top of these buildings. AM is a ground game, which is why the majority of them are PEP. So they are not in places where catastrophes could happen and maybe the signal gets lost. AM radio is the backbone of our ability to reach the American public in times of crisis.
Mr. Shapiro?
Well, I mean, the reality is you have to be listening to AM radio for it to tell you about the crisis, and most people...
And that's why you tune in
and
when there is a crisis.
And when we hear all these statistics about AM radio listening every month and things like that, as a percentage of where you're putting your ears...
But I'm talking about
During an
emergency
emergency, turn on if you
situations.
don't-
I'm talking
right.
about the evacuation that happened when this chemical plant caught on fire.
I
I'm
get
talking
it,
about
and that
hurricanes.
requires that someone be manning that AM station, and one of the questions that's unanswered is how often that actually occurs, because a lot of this is done all electronically from remotely. So one question that Congress has never asked...
If we
and
know
should be
there's a
answered,
hurricane coming, then they're going to be there.
If that
And when
station
that
is manned,
when that plant caught on fire, they went there. They made sure they were there.
and thank God they did, but that
Okay,
may not...
but
There are other cases where they were not there with train derailments and things like that, and the AM station was empty,
But I
and
can
those
assure you they
citizens
got
didn't know.
there, and I'm sure you they got there pretty quick. Now, just one other point, and I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, but I have to say on behalf of what I've been hearing that the interference, that the electric vehicles, and that it can't be fixed. Not only do I find that unbelievable, but I find it very disturbing in the sense that I'm amazed at the innovation that's taking place with EVs. I'm amazed at the progress that they've made. Now you're telling me that they can't fix the problem here with AM radios, the static? Nah, I'm not buying that. I think if you want to bad enough, you can fix it.
Thank you very much.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield.
Yeah, gentleman yields back. Thank you very much. Mr. Chakowski, do you have anything else to add?
No, I just want to thank our witnesses. I have to tell you, this has turned out to be a more popular hearing than I had expected in terms of turnout. I'm very happy about that. I'm sorry I had to leave in the middle. People care about this, and it is important. And so we're going to talk about it further, but I think you hear that there's really a lot of bipartisan concern about doing away with some of the opportunities for individuals and for people. So thank you.
And one thing I wanted to add, and then we'll wrap up, is we didn't get to this, but maybe we can have somebody respond to this, NAB, in writing, though. What is the risk of financial cost to some of these AM radio stations if the AM is not allowed to be in our vehicles? I think that's important, too, because I know people rely on these stations on a daily basis. I see it myself. I listen to AM. All right, thank you very much.
I want to
appreciate
second. I want to second what you just said. That's a good thing, that we should get information from our witnesses on what is the cost then if it goes away.
Yeah. Okay, very good. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list without objection. Made in order, and we're all done, folks. Thank you so very much. Appreciate it. It was an excellent hearing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your testimony.
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I learned so much.
Me too.